Welcome back to the Polaris Energy Finance Podcast. I'm Taylor Rumbold. I'm your host today. Most conversations around the global energy transition happen in rooms where the grid is big, there's a lot of capital, and the policy is locally written. This conversation doesn't. Today, we're talking about what the transition looks like from a market of 3.5 million people sitting between Russia and China, holding some of the most strategically important copper and coal in the world, and about why the rise of artificial intelligence has quietly made the transition a lot more interesting. My guest today is Enkhtur Lkhagvajav. He is Director of Energy, Renewables, and Projects at MCS Group, one of Mongolia's largest conglomerates, with businesses spanning energy, mining, infrastructure, engineering, banking, and beyond. He also sits on the board of MCS International, the group's engineering arm, and spent nearly 3 years on the board of American Chamber of Commerce in Mongolia. And his path there is worth noting. He studied applied mathematics and economics at Brown, took a master's in management at Cambridge Judge, and earned his CFA charter. He started as an investment analyst at Newcomb Group, where he worked on the development and project financing of one of the first utility-scale $120 million renewable project in Mongolia, built with SoftBank's energy arm. He then spent 2 years in Hong Kong at Development Finance Asia, doing private equity and debt across the region before returning to Mongolia to MCS. Enkhtur, welcome to the show.
Hello, Terry, and thank you for inviting me to your show. Great to be here.
Thank you. Before we get into the questions, one quick thing for listeners who don't know the market. Give us the 30-second version of what you're currently doing in Mongolia, what you focus on, and what your remit covers day to day.
MCS Group is one of the largest and one of the first diversified conglomerate in Mongolia. So MCS started as an engineering energy consultancy. So the DNA of company starts from there. Our chairman is electrical engineer himself. And from there on, like MCS Group, like as Mongolia opened up in the 90s, MCS Group expanded to many businesses, starting from like consumer goods. Like MCS is a official distributor of Procter & Gamble, also like a Coca-Cola exclusive bottler. We own like a largest telco company in Mongolia that started in 2006, and also like further company expanded into a more engineering infrastructure arms, constructions, like developed like several waste projects, also mining business, coking coal and gold mining. So from there on, like MCS Group is like a history of Mongolian corporate and history of Mongolian industrial and business development in a way. So like since 90s, like Mongolia, like initially had like energy issues, and also that's why there was a lot of like infrastructure needs. A lot of transmission lines were built. There were several like provinces, like smaller towns and other regions far away from capital that needed like transmission lines or power sources to get connected. So, and from then on, like I believe like since 2010, Mongolia was trying to build new power sources, but unfortunately, like no large new scale power source was built. One of the first IPP, which was the coal-fired power plant, it was built by MCS International for our own need for the mining company in South Gobi region. And during that time, like Newcomb actually built the first wind farm project in a Sakhet region, which was close to Mongolia. It was a 50 megawatt wind farm with international developers and with the, I think, GE wind turbine back then. And since then, like in 2016, like as you mentioned, like with SoftBank, like second wind farm was built, Newcomb and international developers, and one more 55 megawatt wind farm was built in 2017 and 18, which was commissioned then. But ever since then, like there are smaller solar farms were built in between, but no new large power plant until like 2 years ago. The Boruchut, I think 300 megawatt coal-fired power plant was successfully built and connected to Mongolian grid. So as you can see, like there haven't been like many new power plants in Mongolia. Like I think like installed capacity is 1.8 gigawatts for 3.5 million people, and majority is for Ulaanbaatar city, the capital. But as Mongolian GDP is growing, there's a lot of industries coming online for Mongolia to grow further. Just for normal residential and normal industrial purposes, we need new power plants. And on top of it, if you add like newer, industries such as it's getting like trendy and more popular and more in demand now, like data centers, AI data centers, or like even more heavier industries from going to the world to like maybe like just beside copper mining, if you want to do maybe like a copper smelter, iron ore smelter, steel mine, etc. All of them will require energy source, electricity. So that's why from Mongolia now is at the crossroad for our next stage of growth. And yeah, like I see like there will be a lot of demand for power sources, whether fossil fuel or renewable. So through that, like our group, since it started from energy field, electricity field, but that's DNA of the company, we are looking into utility scale developments that can provide electricity to Mongolia, Mongolian industries, so that we can help the Mongolian as a country to grow further. So that's the main work I do, and that's like main projects I'm looking for, like specifically in the renewable energy, like wind and solar developments in Mongolia.
That was a very fantastic overview of Mongolia's past 30 years of industrialization history woven with MCS and also energy and critical infrastructure that you all are working on. So before we delve into what you have been describing in terms of Mongolian energy landscape, which is really exciting, I want to start with your own route in because I feel like that's not really an obvious one. You started in applied math and economics at Brown, went to Cambridge, earned the CFA, which to me is a fairly classic path into a bank or a fund. But you ended up structuring wind projects in Mongolia instead. What was that decision point? What made you interested in energy?
So I guess like when I graduated from Brown, I before I knew I was accepted to for master's program at Cambridge, I got this job at this PE fund, like a small PE fund, family office one that was funded by a London-based high net worth individuals. So I was looking into a lot of like investments, and it was Mongolia focused. So we looked in a lot of real estate, a lot of like smaller mines, and also consumer related goods back then. So so back then, like it was like if you to give a context, it was 2015. So from Mongolian perspective, Mongolia was a commodity-based economy. Like that was one of the major drivers of Mongolian growth since 2008. So like commodity prices weren't doing well since 2012. And Mongolia, I think like back in 2010, over-leveraged because like at the time there was a commodity big boom. And once the commodity prices declined, I guess like many like companies and Mongolia as a country was not experienced for that. It's kind of a collapse. So like there was some like debt pressure to Mongolia, and there was a lot of issues related to the economic. But fortunately, like everything didn't go as bad as some people precipitated. People were expecting like a full bankruptcy and Mongolia declaring bankruptcy, going default. But Mongolia did pay obligations, did raise new funding, and also the commodity prices increased since 2017 and etc. So like Mongolian economy survived without major default, and now like I think since then it's grew. I'm not sure an exact percentage, but like GDP per capita, for example, is almost like the 7,000 level. But for back then it was like a 4,000 level, so maybe you can say it's almost doubled the GDP per capita wise. But that being said, like going back to 2015 when I was working, like at time wasn't very good, but the fund was very opportunistic. Was they maybe saw opportunities? Was they believed in Mongolians' growth? And they saw the current economic challenges of 2015-16. I just mentioned as a temporary one. So I was looking at many opportunities back then, and then like there were some mining opportunities, but like gold one was specifically interesting, but gold price wasn't that trendy as what it is now. It was like very risky, and we didn't even know if the commodity will rebound. So at that time, like I had like that was a very good first job in my opinion, because I got to introduce to many industries in Mongolia, got to understand economics, and also like my supervisors were very smart, and I got to like I learned like economics, I learned finance through my studies, but it was never applied one. So that specific brief stunt like gave me like a lot of insight on how economics and finance were applied to a real work. And also like how like challenging economics was, because my supervisor made me read a lot of like debt default related cases, like how Argentina like structured its debt, how like funds were involved in it, and how government acted, and how debt was finally structured and economy got back. I think there were several other country cases, like Korea case was also interesting. 1997, like Korea also has some issues with debt. IMF came in and there was some challenges, but Korea rebounded, and we all know like South Korea is very strong economically since then. Like, so that was like very good brief work, and I learned a lot. And at the time, I got accepted in master's program, so I went to Cambridge, studied 1 year. And at the time, I was also interested in engineering and some kind of like a heavy industry or some industrial related projects. And right at that moment, like Newcorm, SoftBank, we were trying to build like a 50 MW wind farm in Mongolia, in Soft Gobi specifically. So that project was specifically interesting because, as mentioned, like the time Mongolia wasn't doing that well economically, and it was only one of the few projects that got funding for a major project. It was like 120 million. Well, like for larger countries, I guess like that's maybe not the big scale for Mongolian at the time, at the situation, and also economic size wise, like it was a significant project. So that was interesting. And SoftBank, as we know, like it's a very interesting company back then. Like it's becoming even more interesting with AI recently, but at the time, like my social sounds, Norwegians, and everything was very interesting, and I was wanted to be a part of that. So I joined that project, and I think like quarter 2, yes, sometime between after July in 2016. So at that time, the construction was just starting. I think construction work started in October, and it was built within 1 year. So one good thing about the project is like it was one of the fastest built, I think, wind farm in the world. Vestas was EPC, I think. Yeah, so it was one of the fastest built wind farm, and also I guess like I think like more than 90% of the workers were Mongolians. So, and many Mongolians learned like a valuable experience from that work on that went to work in many different regions, from my understanding. So it was like a very good project. So yeah, that's how I started, and since then, like I think like one of the things I learned was like I quickly got to learn Mongolian energy sector and challenges. And one of the big challenge of connecting renewables to a system itself was like renewable wind and solar is very. It's not like a fossil fuel related or nuclear power plant that provides, or even hydropower plant that provides like electricity on a stable basis, right? Because if there's no wind, if there's no solar, then there's no power. So for a Mongolian grid system at that time, like it was difficult to accept more renewables after the third wind farm. So a lot of like newer wind farms were stopped because the grid simply cannot accept more power. So to accept more power, Mongolia grid needed like either to build new coal-fired power plants, because Mongolia doesn't have a natural gas yet discovered. So like only reliable like a potential like a burning power is from coal. But the issue was none of the international bank will fund coal-fired power. So it took like a lot of time until like a new power plant was built. The other option is obviously like a nuclear, but nuclear stuff takes like 7 years and 8 years. And also like at the time, I don't think Mongolia had like a reliable supply of uranium or uranium fuel to build the power plant. Also cost-wise, it was costly and dear. And hydropower plant maybe perhaps was the obvious choice, but due to the environmental related issues that was raised by our northern neighbors, the hydropower plant couldn't build safely as well. So only option was coal, but new coal power plants is built now. And also battery systems playing a big role, because at the time in 2050s, battery wasn't that cheap as it is now. So the cost has been, I think, more than half now. And well, it's still expensive to build large enough batteries, but still it's manageable now. So like if you build like a large enough battery, perhaps like some of the issues of the wind and solar's intermittency can be solved. So that was the understanding back then. And after like the wind farm, the city wind farm that was built by SoftBank in Yukon was completed, like we were looking to some other potential opportunities, but at the time, because of the understanding, I saw that there's going to be like several years until maybe like a new reliable power source will be connected. And like exact time, like through my other connection, I got into this Hong Kong fund, and the job opportunity was interesting because I'm from like a finance and investment field myself, and I liked my first, as mentioned, like a brief PE job. So I wanted to do something more substantially more general investment related work. So I joined that Hong Kong based fund, which was run by this very smart American fund manager. And we have overseen a lot of investments throughout like Mongolia and Asia Pacific. Like back in 2019, we've done like several large deals in Mongolia related with real estate, and also like one FMCG, fast moving consumer good related deal. So all of them was a very good learning curve for me. And also the fund, I think like from that consumer good deal, for example, has done very well. Because at the time it was sort of mispriced and misunderstood, but all the signs were there that it will be recovered, it will be more understood. And what generally, as you can see from my career print, firstly, like I done a brief stint on a general field, then I worked on a very specific project. So if you work in a very specific project, you learn a lot about in details about one specific industry. But then I moved on to a more general field where you can learn a lot about different industries. And also like generally investment, like working in investment finance and fund is interesting because like from that perspective, you learn how to see what the investor is seeing, what investors want. And also, since you worked in a project company, I also had the understanding like what the people who are receiving the money also see. So like, from that perspective, it was interesting.
You described sort of Mongolia, which is a relatively commodity exposed market, was over leveraged in 2010s, but rebounded fairly well. And you have worked across energy project, private equity investing, and also consumer goods, have lots of exposures across investing, especially in a developing country. So just curious to hear about what were some of those specific lessons you learned about working in energy on the ground in Mongolia, but also working on the investing side in Hong Kong? If you were to like highlight one or two examples of each where you feel like, oh, I couldn't have learned this the other way around, what would you describe those experiences and lessons to be, especially in energy?
For energy one, the exact deal was project finance. So like project finance is an interesting concept because it's like you sort of assign all the risks first. Yes, the reason why I do it is that way like it can be project finance to lenders for a long period of time because infrastructure itself is a very capital heavy project, and unless like there's like a very large player, there's a big enough balance sheet to take all the risk, or multiple investors with the experience that can take it. It's a very difficult thing. So that's why project financing concept was, I think, born. Like it's not only energy one, it's also related with like maybe metro or some other like large enough projects like mining, for example, like some mining projects like Mongolian Ayutthaya Rio Tinto's expansion to underground is considered a project finance. Like it received, I think, like a 15 commercial and international banks finance. But for energy field specifically, like classic project finance structure can be applied. Why? Because the reason why is because firstly, the revenue can be calculated, and revenues risk can be initially assigned through PPA, power purchase agreements, where the buyer and seller can agree on exact terms and exact, risk mitigations on what will happen in certain scenario in that contract PPA. So that way, from lenders' view, like they can see what will happen if certain scenarios will happen. And how do you block some other risks? Okay, so like revenue risk is secured through PPA, but operation risk, right? There can be like operational issues. How do you solve it? So it's solved by O&M and long-term service agreements with the original equipment provider that can provide certain warranties and certain guarantees through their maintenance. So that way, lenders can be more safe when about like uncertainties related to the operation. And there are so many other uncertainties, like what will happen, if like there's like an earthquake, for example, or if there's like a damage to the plant, etc. So those can be covered with insurance. And you can like do all sort of like a risk assignment that way. So that way, project wise, like lenders can see like how risks are assigned and how like mitigation actions will be taken. And because of that, lenders can do like a non-recourse loan. So that means non-recourse means that sponsors don't have to take a risk on the project, because they are taking risk with their equity. They are funding the project equity, but like if there is like a certain events that goes beyond that does more damage than the equity invested, then to those many mechanisms, like as I mentioned, like the PPA security revenue, operation side can be, like a risk can be shared through O&M and long-term service agreements, and insurance also plays a big role, right? So through those mechanisms, like equity sponsors and lenders can be secure about how risk is assigned. So it's a very big lesson on the risk and return wise. So with that, and was an interesting concept in energy. And from there on, like because it's a project finance, one can learn so many things about equity side. Like as I mentioned, like how much risk is equity taking, and because of that risk, what kind of return equity investor can see. And also you can learn about from debt side too, because project finance itself involves like a large enough debt from many lenders. So that was like initially very good, like a way to learn equity, debt, risk assignment, and general contracting commercial terms. From then on, like when I moved on to some other deals to like in the investment fund, what you do is like we done like a lot of like equity or some semi-equity or debt related deals. So it all goes there, like you see like you invest in some, let's say some farm that wants to buy like tractors or some equipment to increase their productivity. So even though it's not exactly energy related, so you can think from same perspective, like what will happen, certain risk will happen. And if that risk is not taken by anyone, that means the investor is taking the risk. So investor has a fair, way to say, okay, this kind of a risk is what investor is taking. If the market is not proven, then investors maybe would require higher return. And from the borrowers or the investee side, they also need to recognize, because if they cannot secure other funding that way, that means there's an unassigned market risk that someone needs to take more risk, right? So that's why, like for them, initially the investment will be costly. But through certain phases, if certain things proven, and if they can show that risk can be managed, the subsequent rounds, they can fairly ask for a lower, interest rate, lower yield, etc. So, and how do you structure that? And involvement of consultancies, involvement of legal advisors, and structuring the best kind of a contract on security and on the commercial terms of all of them. Like even though it's not exactly energy, but like terms related with commercial terms and PPA, insurance terms, and operation terms is all somewhat related. So like you can see, like once you have that like initial good understanding of equity side, risk return side, debt structuring side, and insurance mechanism, it can be applied to many different investment structures, not specifically to energy. It can be applied to beverage, it can be applied to real estate, and etc. So that was my like a learning curve in investment, and most importantly, risk and return, because this two always comes in together. If it's something sounds too good to be true, and return is very high, if the yield, interest yield or profit someone is promising too high, but if it's something like unproven thing, most likely there's a risk that's not been addressed, risk that's not been disclosed. So that's like a very, I think, important mindset someone should have. Yeah.
Always comes with the challenge of pricing the risk at the right time and hedging those risks through elegant deal structuring, which you've been able to do for the past decade. A lot of our listeners have a mental model of the US grid and maybe of China's. Very few have one from Mongolia. So let's try to fix that. And it was very helpful that you described sort of your experience with PF in Mongolia. And you also mentioned the challenges that Mongolia was facing in the energy industry for the past decade or so. So can you give the listeners the shape of Mongolia's power systems dynamic over the past 10 years? So from capacity fuel mix to import dependence, and why the geography makes it hard, and if there are any sort of projects that you worked on that helped to address those challenges over the past 10 years. And it's changing a lot, especially with large scale mining and infrastructure projects, as you mentioned earlier. And my second question following that is that Mongolia has world-class wind and solar resources in the Gobi, especially, and the Asian supergrid thesis was built exactly on that. A decade on, why has so little been built? Is the binding constraint resource grid, offtake, financing, as you're describing earlier, or policy? What's going on in the energy world in this part of the world?
So yeah, like I guess like Mongolian energy system volume wise around like maybe like 80% is like fossil fuel power, and around 20% is a wind and solar mix. I think that's 1.8 gigawatts now. And recently, like there has been like wind farms that was built as mentioned, like 155 megawatts of wind farm is connected to the grid, and I think around like maybe 100 megawatts, slightly maybe more solar is connected to grid. So that's good. It's a 20%, but then to connect more, like Mongolia needed more firming power, more stable power source, like that can be like a coal, gas, or maybe nuclear power plant, or build large enough batteries. But then, like building large enough battery itself, maybe not as commercially as viable compared to building like a coal-fired power plant. But building coal-fired power plant itself is challenging from getting like a funding because yeah, like international banks stop financing them. So that was like I think one of the main issues. Also, like main issue was also like project developers and regulators at the time maybe had lost the window to get funding for coal-fired power plant because CHP5 was, I think, coal-fired power plant number 5 was, I'm understanding around 2000, early 2010, like there was a consortium that wanted to build, but because of like certain like issues on getting the approvals in a timely matter, etc. Like I think the window was lost because international financiers stopped funding them. So if maybe like that, those projects were more expedited and more done faster before this was done, then perhaps this could have been funded to project finance. But newer coal-fired plants is more getting financed, and I think like those are connected to grid. Like as mentioned, like 300 megawatts of coal-fired power plant was connected to grid like 2 years ago, and that's expanding its capacity. And also, from understanding, several other like mid-size and coal-fired plants will be connected to the grid soon. So what does it mean? It means like Mongolia can allow to see more renewables. Like I think like more renewables is possible because grid will be stable. So that means like currently Mongolia imports like a Russian power from for peak periods, and for industrial users like we also import power from China. So that's been the case because Mongolia couldn't been able to build power plants fast enough, and as mentioned, like a window to get coal-fired power plant, which was the only like viable firming solution for Mongolia, was closed because international banks stopped funding them. But now like there's another chance to do more, and perhaps like a large enough wind farms and solar farms could be considered. And so like in the next few years, recently, like for example, Mongolian Ministry of Energy declared certain auctions for solar projects, and like there was 5 solar project, each like 20, on average 20 megawatts. Solar project was successfully like auctioned for the first time, and I think currently also ministry is doing certain auctions for wind ones. So those projects will help Mongolia to get more power to the grid, and also to like support growth, because electricity is source of all growth. Because without electricity, you can't do anything. You can't do this call, right? You can't do this call, and we can't host this online, and data center can't run, and that means that we can't host this video. Based data center, etc. So also we can't use your fintech. We can't use like our phones, telco. Everything is reliant on electricity. So for Mongolians to grow further, we need electricity. So I think those projects, ministry and private sectors that are initiating will help Mongolia to grow faster, and large enough wind farms and solar farms can be planned. Okay, you mentioned about Asian supergrid. So that was like one of the concepts that the SoftBank was talking about, like building like a large enough wind farms and solar farms to export to Asia, because Mongolia is like a very good wind resource and solar resource, right? So the one of the issues is like to export power from one sovereign to other sovereign itself is very challenging because it will require like a high level government, not only a high level government like agreement, it will require many like very fine details like contracts to allow that. Okay, it will take time for governments to reach agreement. And secondly, I guess like from Mongolia side, we need to prove that we can do like a large enough project. Like maybe like if like I've mentioned just as I mentioned like a few minutes ago, Mongolia itself is deploying power related new sources, right? So if we can't build our own power plants with like large enough wind farms or large enough, like a solar farms to supply our own needs, like how could we like convince investors that we can build even larger renewable to export to other countries? So that means like one of the lessons from our side, we need to show the world that we can supply like a green, clean energy to the grid, to the big industrial users. And if you can show like in a certain phases, then perhaps that can be the stepping stone that we can sort of talk in a high level that we can export this power. So it should be done in a phases. So from that perspective, I guess like because of certain constraints and because of economic challenges, actually 2015 and 17, like those things have slowed down. But right now, I think like the focus and the gear is back on. Like I think like we are trying to develop like a large enough renewables, and in subsequent maybe in a several year time, like if we can do it in certain phases, maybe we'll do like a certain project first that could supply like in industries and supply certain like smaller regions. And then if you can expand through that, we can supply like an even larger region that can be like a stepping stone to export those power sources in the futures.
You mentioned sort of large industries being the off-takers and being on the demand side. And as you mentioned earlier, energy doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have these large industrial players driving up demand. We have AI-related load growth globally, and also mining has, especially critical minerals, have gotten very pronounced global focus in recent years. Before tying all those in, you mentioned a few constraints that are facing the Mongolian grid from further development. If you could fix exactly one of those tomorrow, like just one, not a wish list, just one, which one do you think will unlock the most megawatts? And then I think we'll talk about some mining and AI related questions after that.
Yeah, I guess like one of the biggest constraint is because nobody believes that renewable energy can supply like a reliable power. So like, just as I mentioned like many times, because like we reach certain like threshold, people like I guess like it's people saw that we can't increase renewable anymore. So because of that, no new renewables have been connected. Or some of them are safety issues because grid can receive damage like what we saw in Spain, for example. Like there was a big blackout, right? Yeah, because of I'm not sure what was the exact reason, but some of the reports are saying because there was like a intermittency related with big solar. So there is a fair amount of concern. Like if nobody wants the entire system to receive like a system-wide blackout. But I guess second reason is like I guess like nobody saw like how to creatively solve them. So then now like it's been like more than 10 years since 2015. There's so many other, and also like people actually can see that renewables are becoming commercially viable compared to not only some stuff like received some subsidy. Like before then, like EV cars received subsidy, like renewable in some places received more favorable feed-in tariffs. But now, like it's becoming the cheapest possible source because of technologies getting cheaper. Like in China, like wind farm is built in a massive scale. So, like I think like around 200 gigawatts of renewables is built every year, wind and solar, and that's like more than Germany and France combined. Like I think France and Germany has over 100 gigawatts capacity, installed capacity. So China is one country is building like a huge amount of renewable every year, and it's commercially viable. It's cheap. It's secure. in America, United States, like they stopped. I think I'm not sure if it's fully stopped, but I think like the new administration's policies not about like providing subsidies. It's about more for just like letting them be, right? Like if they can get connected, they can be built commercially, then it can happen. But what we are seeing now is like United States is actually second biggest renewable energy installer in the world after China. I think they built like 40 gigawatts of wind and solar. Like states like Texas is building like a very large wind farms, and California has the biggest solar farms, etc. Like, why are they getting done? Because it's commercially viable. So just like that, I think like wind farm and solar farms has reached a certain price range that it can be viable, and intermittency issues can be creatively solved through a mix of maybe battery system, a mix of like more smarter energy and peak demand, calculations, and also like firming options and how to involve firming more strategically. Like if you can combine all of them, I think like large enough wind farms can be developed and can be provided to the grid. So the biggest constraint is unlocking the mind, unlocking showing the countries, showing the region, and maybe showing the world that it can be done. Then I think like after like first or second like success case, like more and more can be built more easily, more faster, and that, like as I mentioned in my previous answer to the previous question, will be the stepping stone in building like an even larger system, and maybe at some point proving that like a regional energy export is viable, like that Asian supergrid concept.
Right on. I mean, the narrative around sort of the energy transition and renewable energy has always been very dynamic. For about 15 years or so, the energy transition was relatively a substitution story, right? Clean electrons replacing dirty ones, relatively on a flat demand. And a lot of the public perception and policymakers' perception came from that. However, in the last 2 or 3 years, that's been changing. Demand is growing again and at an extremely rapid pace. And a large part of the reason is compute, as you're saying, the reason why we're able to publish this podcast on the internet, right? And also AI related growth. So you wrote after PDAC 2026 that AI is no longer just a technology sector story, but a demand driver for mining. Sort of, can you walk us through that transmission mechanism from a data center being built to a mine, and by extension, an energy project being financed? And how does that look for Mongolia?
Yeah, so I see like this AI trend. Like previously, all the technology trends were more software related. They didn't use that much like a data center. Like maybe streaming services used a lot of data, but all other like softwares, like software as a service and other ones, like of course they used a lot of cloud data, but they didn't use as aggressively as artificial intelligence. Now, I don't think many people saw electricity and power as a critical one, like 10 years ago when technology, like sector to software related booms related with technology was growing. But now with the artificial intelligence, electricity is back on, how they call it, like a sexy list, I would say, because like nobody talked about energy that much 10 years ago. Nobody talked about power that much. But right now, like if you just go to any major news site, any major analysis, all of them talks about, oh, we're gonna need so much power, and we need to find a way to have to power them, have to fund them, right? So, one good thing AI sector done for energy sector is it brought electricity sector into a top tier again, and then more appreciation it's receiving now, because like electricity is the backbone of everything of the modern age. Without power, we can't do anything. Of 21st century's uh, technology is all on electricity. So that being said, okay, so AI itself is requiring, like all this data center built ups and all this infrastructures to support. Those infrastructures are not built from nothing. Yeah? You need something. Data center itself will require like a massive amount of like a construction materials and most likely copper, because copper runs through electricity wire, and all these servers and etc. They use like a lot of like metals. And more importantly, one of the trendy topic again is the semiconductors, right? Not the softwares of semiconductors, the design, like specifically manufacturing of semiconductor requires a lot of materials as well, specifically rare earth is also used in all of them. So rare earth is becoming critical, and this all critical mineral thing has become all the trendy buzzword nowadays. That's because all this supply chain is required to build reliable, not only data centers, but all the modern infrastructures of the civil and engineering related and all the, the semiconductor technology we need them. So that's like one aspect. So you need mining, you need minerals for that. And second aspect is data center is not going to run on its own. It's going to require electricity. So like going back to my first point, and how do you get electricity to power plants, right? Coal power plants, natural gas power plants, nuclear power plants, renewable. So the biggest, I think, like geopolitical like issue here is how do you power like a new powers in the future? So United States, from my understanding, is more focusing on a nuclear one. Like nuclear, they see and nuclear as a more future power. And until they develop more enough nuclear, like at least like that's some of the view from some of the advisors of the current administration. Like from what I'm seeing is they're just gonna do a lot of natural gas related power plant, and if renewables can be connected commercially, that's good. But they're not gonna fully like subsidize them or anything. So, but they're gonna support like fossil fuel one because that's the most reliable and lowest carbon power America can produce, because natural gas is like several, I think like more than 70-80% times it produces less carbon than coal-fired one. So it's very good, and also it's very cheap comparatively to everything else. And it can be built very fast because if it's very easy to install like a small enough gas generator, or if you're building like a more combined large coal power plant, that's also more faster compared to nuclear one. So nuclear one is an interesting angle, and that's also driving the demand of uranium. Nuclear itself is one of the lowest carbon producing reliable power source that we can build. And then like since like big enough, maybe like nuclear plants is maybe like costly, and maybe some regions may not require that big enough nuclear ones. Like this small modular reactor concept is taken up, right? Something that can be like submarines use like a half 500 megawatts, or maybe some of them 300 or 400 megawatts of small reactors. So similar, like if like smaller reactors can be built in a standardized way, like it can be built much faster, much cheaper, and yeah, as you can see, like it's gonna be the lowest carbon producing power plant. So that looks like a viewpoint. Like maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I see. Like for example, US is going, because they are not like a leader in a wind farm, or leader in a solar. So if they're gonna use more wind and solar, like strategically, that means they're gonna buy them from China. And from what I see is America wants to do it on their own, like not only like a mining related one, also the technology. Okay, that's the US view. From Chinese view, like they're doing everything. They're building like they're building like a large enough coal-fired plants because they have huge need, and they have coal because they're building big coal-fired plants. But more than coal, they're building very large nuclear ones, and on top of it, they're the biggest builder of renewables, and they have the best companies in wind and solar. So that's the Chinese angle. They are not only supporting one specific industry, they're supporting everything, like nuclear, wind, and solar, and coal. But recently they're slowing down on coal, but that is a good reason, because they see like wind farms and solar farms, they have a strategic advantage because they have all the supply chains, like from steel to rare earth access, and they have good companies with large enough scale that can produce them cheaply. So they see advantage, and so they also see that the gap, the leadership of who's gonna produce like a more green economy to help the world to fight climate is left vacant now, and China is taking that, home now. But in the next 20, 30 years, like I'm not sure how it's gonna continue. Like if more wind and solar can be built, that's great. Or if the nuclear technology can be evolved and nuclear technology can become like something you can deploy faster and more cheaply compared to like a traditional nuclear power plants that the world is building now, then I can see like a nuclear related power can have like a very big role in supplying clean energy to the world. So I talked about a lot of energy side. So tying back to the original topic, okay, artificial intelligence dominance, will require large enough computing powers, large enough data centers, and large enough heavy industries to make equipments, semiconductors, etc. So for that, you need like a power. So I addressed the power related topic, and going to the topic itself, like power ones, like wind farms and solar ones, even the coal, nuclear, all of them will also require large enough minerals and metals. So they're not gonna come out of nowhere. Someone needs to mine them, someone needs to process them. So world itself, like since 2010, I think like slowed down in investment with new mines. And also like in a good reason, there are more easier mines, from my understanding, like copper, for example, all the open pit, large enough copper mines, it has been explored in the last 100 or 200 years. And remaining like new sources will come from more underground mines, like Enkhtur in Mongolia, for example, which has an underground mine. So underground mine itself is a very like engineering wise is a complex in the because it's not like easy as an open pit one. It will require careful planning and a lot of permitting, and also in the regions that has like perhaps like a lower in a very it's gonna be most likely in a region that's uh will be far away from central infrastructure. So any mining projects will basically become like a big infra project itself, because someone needs to build the power line that will go to the mine, because there's likely not going to be any power plant nearby, and someone needs to build all other auxiliary infrastructures like railways, etc. And like in Africa, they built like 1,000 kilometers of like a railway so that the mine can export, and they're also building like a power plant that will supply the mine, right? So similar in Mongolia, like cases will be same, and similar in everywhere else in the next 10 years, all these mines will require like a heavy investment because it's not open pit. It will be like most likely like an underground related mines in a difficult environment, far away from infrastructure. So all the auxiliary infrastructure will require funding. So that's the angle in mining, and why is it becoming even important now is just like mentioned, like right now, like the sources of those mines are limited and lead time is very long. Like if you think of OT, like I think it was maybe like first real export like maybe around 2002. So that's more than 20 years ago. Investment agreement with government was maybe signed in 2008. So that means since then, like it took like how many years? What, perhaps like 14 years until like a first underground mine operation started. And in between, there has been, of course, like a certain more negotiations on the deal, right? So one side wasn't happy, and I guess it, to go forward, like they needed to renegotiate certain terms, which happened. And I guess like it took 14 years to reach the point now the OT is producing like a more reliable copper, but it still hasn't reached the peak here. From understanding, peak will be in 2030. So there will be like 4 more years until. So it took like a massive amount of investments, massive amount of time and to reach this level. So any new like underground mine is going to take similar. Like Resolute mine in America, for example, was also an underground copper mine. It took like 20 years for Rio, and maybe BHP was minor investor. I think Rio BHP had the joint venture. From understanding up until now, like they still haven't, progressed like to development of next stage yet. So that's the, like a challenge. It takes time, and engineering itself is complex. So that's why supplying to more reliable, like a good producer is ever more important.
Yeah, as they say, patience is virtue. Um, Curious to hear about your take on Mongolia's place in all of it, right? Because you've been on the American Chamber of Commerce for nearly 3 years. What is one thing that foreign investors most, I guess, consistently get wrong about Mongolia in either direction, good or bad? And also, this is not an investing advice, of course, but just based on your experience and the global context of energy, critical minerals, and AI-led growth, is there an opportunity for foreign investors to invest in Mongolia as it relates to these three sectors?
Yeah, so I guess like opportunities are always there, but I guess like, from American view, like I would say like because Mongolia I think wasn't really in a big radar of a big investors, because if there's like an institutional big investor, most likely they want to do like a large enough deals. by large, I mean like a size-wise, it needs to be large because they run like a big ship and they don't want to spend a lot of time working on a smaller deal. Because like any deal, like starting from like a maybe like let's say like a $10 million deal, $100 million deal, $1 billion deal, all of them require same amount of human work time. Like someone needs to do analysis and some lawyers need to draft up a contract, right? So from the large funds itself, that smaller investments, even if they're very successful, it's not gonna move the needle. So they wanna focus on bigger deals. So unfortunately, Mongolian size was like a negative factor. And I think like a mining itself wasn't very, like interesting until recently, like now, like money and energy sector wasn't very, on a radar of the traditional American, like or Western investors, I think. But now like things have changed. Like if you like mentioned, like if you like check any like a major news, like maybe the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, often talks about okay, we're gonna need more critical minerals, we're gonna need some mining supply, we're gonna need power sources. So now those industries are back on table. So I think like with that renewed interest, like I think like many more interesting investors may have looked on Mongolia. And from the American side, I guess like the biggest like issue was I guess like those professional big funds didn't really see Mongolia as a target country, but now with this mining related things, maybe they could creatively look on ways on how to do like a deal. So that's on interest. So I guess like to answer to your question, the whole industry that Mongolia had competitive advantage was not on a radar of many like major American investors now. But now like there are so many focused funds, even set up by like large funds like BlackRock set up their energy and mining infrastructure related fund, and I think like even like some PE funds are doing that. Like Elliott Management started this mining related fund, and all this funds are getting more interest to the mining and energy related field now. So I think maybe now like in the next few years, professional institutional investors can actually look on the deals.
Yeah, and I think Mongolia, in a lot of ways, is on path for a lot of potential for success in these areas. Especially, I think data centers is a big question. Which geographically may not make a lot of sense to have, data centers necessarily within Mongolia, but from a cooling perspective, Mongolia has rather cooler climate. So, I think there's a lot of opportunities, but there are also some constraints that investors and developers will need to overcome to reach that success. Um, Curious to get a bit of your take on the careers related to energy and mining and finance right now, sort of in the 21st century, especially in 2026, with AI changing so much of how we work and how we understand the world. What's the underrated skill in energy and mining finance right now? And wouldn't say overrated, but what might people be overlooking to learn in these spaces?
People often overlook things that are not on the radar, right? Because when like during dot-com boom, like what everyone saw was like they wanted to invest in certain like e-commerce or related businesses, and they forgot about everything else. Basically, everything else wasn't on the radar back in 90s. But since then, there are so many companies that grew and become very successful. Similarly, like I think like after 2008 and 2010, there was this questionnaire online that showed okay, Netflix, Amazon, Google, and I think that fourth one was Domin Domino's Pizza, right? The pizza company. So the question was which of these companies had like a most return or stocks as the most return, and then maybe most of the people chose actually Netflix, and but the correct answer was a pizza company. So that's a really interesting one. So like from an analysis perspective, like people often just see the winners, obvious winners or obvious ones on a median trend, right? Because it's a herd mentality. So, but they don't see like secondary or tertiary sectors. Okay, so I'm kind of moving away from like your specific question. So specifically, if I focus on energy and maybe mining related one, I would say like it's just like that. Like we should focus on like we could try to see a bigger picture. Like everyone is seeing copper now because copper is the obvious one that looks like gonna be winner. I'm not sure if the pricing will continue to go up or not, but I think it has a good chance. So everyone is seeing it's a good winner, and everyone looking for a copper mine. But from my view, like it's just my view. Could be right or wrong, not the investment advice. What can be also interesting is, for example, like I see like a floor spar, it's like a full floor spar that's used to make full fluoride. It's a chemical compound that is used to make cooler for air conditioner. So why is it important? Because if the data centers are going to expand in the next 10, 20 years in ungodly way, like all this Amazons and Googles are just going to spend like hundreds or tens of billions of dollars building data center, coolers will come in place. Someone needs to supply that chemical to make air conditioner. And second one is all this global heat waves, right? Like I think you mentioned in Washington, D.C. it's very hot now, right? I think the whole Europe experienced like a very long, prolonged heat wave, or most likely 2 or 3 years consecutive, and some scientists are going to say it's going to become the norm, these heat waves. India and other regions, all of them are experiencing air conditioner. So like maybe like a 20, 30 years ago, like maybe air conditioner, some people have thought that air conditioner is a luxury good. Like you can survive without air conditioner, but it's also just a nice thing to have. But maybe in the next 10 years, it's going to become the necessity. Because without air conditioner, it's very difficult to live. So I see like this fluoride, of course they can develop all the newer, better technology, but in the near future, perhaps the demand of it could be higher, because it's not only driven by like one specific industry, it's going to be driven by the whole global environment, like air conditioners for residential uses, commercial uses. By commercial use, I mean like offices, shopping malls, and also the data centers, they're going to use it more. So that's like one way, maybe just think that idea I just told is just my opinion. It can be wrong, but the similar, like just seeing the big picture and not only focusing on a big winner is an important skill in analysis.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. Folks listening to the podcast, you all heard it first. Rapid fire questions. Copper in 2030, higher or lower in real terms?
I think it will be higher.
Higher.
Yeah. Okay. So if I just provide brief explanation, because of supply constraint first and demand, and also thirdly, like I think just overall, like monetary base will be larger back then, and not only copper. Like I think everything will be more expensive in nominal value ways. So like because of these three factors, I see it's gonna be higher. Yeah.
Not. Nuclear in Mongolia. This decade, next decade, or never?
Well, I'm more optimistic in that. So maybe like in the next decade, like I can definitely see there's gonna be a lot of like innovations in Mongolia itself. Just recently, like 2 years ago, uh, at this investment agreement with the French company Orana. It's one of the largest uranium miner and uranium fuel maker to develop a big uranium project in Mongolia. I think in the next few years, maybe that there'll be more of this project, and in the next subsequent year, somewhat newer technologies, maybe like small reactors or even like a traditional like power plants could become like a viable to develop in Mongolia. So next decade.
Right on. Last rapid fire question. The bigger constraint on the global energy transition, minerals or transmission?
Well, I would say it's transmission because like I think like one of the big energy like developments in next in future will still be from renewable because that's the fastest way you can develop the wind farms and solar farms, fastest way to deploy. But wind and solar is not uniform because for some regions have a poor wind resource and poor solar one, and some regions have very good wind and solar. So how to transmit them to the regions with a high demand will be the big question. So there's solutions like maybe like building like a very long range, high voltage DC lines. That's one option. China has many, they shown. And I think America also had this plans to build wind farms in I think like in a central part of United States, for example, where there's like in Kansas, it's sort of like a plain region, right? So they have a good wind, building large wind farms there, and then building high voltage DC lines to the more urban centers, like over thousands of kilometers long was one of the projects. So if they can do it, then that's possible. But that transmission line is expensive, and it's going to require a lot of permitting because it's going to go through so many regions, etc. So that's one thing. And secondly, I think we need to think more creatively in terms of energy, electricity. Because once we think of power, most people only think of electricity, like renewable wind farms, solar farms, coal farms, nuclear, like you name it. Everyone just thinks it's just producing electricity. But then what they don't see is electricity doesn't mean it need to go through a transmission line to the end user directly. It can be, used to make, it can use like a different modules or different transportation ways to reach the end user. And a lot more things I'm just thinking is like, if there's like a large enough cheap wind farms and solar farms, they can produce like hydrogen more cheaply, green hydrogen. And green hydrogen itself can be transported in a way that's more efficient, or maybe it can be made into a green ammonia, and then it can be transported a little bit more safely than green hydrogen because it's more stable from my understanding to the end user. And then from end user, the ammonia, green hydrogen can be converted back to electricity in some smaller, modular hydrogen or ammonia related power plants. And that can be a one way to think of constraints. So if it's very difficult to build transmission lines in some region, be like a pipeline. Or it can be more reliable, like a sea transport, like a LNG, or like now they're doing, they can transport ammonia, green hydrogen through tankers to the end user. So that kind of possibilities are just one way to think. And I think a lot of like smart people are working there, that in the next 10 years, like once technology becomes more advanced, and once, like a large scale projects at the world, then all of those will be possibilities. So solving transmission will be the key to getting like a more energy, not only clean energy, like I'm talking about, because I think like because if you assign clean energy, green energy, people just think somewhat it's subsidized power, right? They have to think that wind or solar power plant is the most commercially viable cheap power plants they're actually seen. So from that perspective, I would just call them like a receiving energy or receiving electricity to home. Yeah.
Answered like a true mathematician. Like that was such a creative answer. How we define transmission or how to overcome that challenge in such a creative way. I think sometimes when we think about energy challenges, we think of them in linear terms of it, just like we need to solve for this to solve, to get this. But the way you answered it was very creative and hopefully gave our listeners a new lens to look at some of these challenges, but also opportunities. Enkhtur, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. This really was a refreshing conversation, a fresh perspective, and it's exactly the conversation that I wanted to have. Where should people follow your work? And I also ask this at the end of my podcast all the time. Who would you recommend that I invite to my podcast next?
I guess like I don't have like a public platforms that I share things, but perhaps my LinkedIn will be my closest thing. Sometimes I share some news and stuff, and if people like want to connect me to that, like I'll be open to chat more. Like LinkedIn, like perhaps I can give you my LinkedIn ID and you can post it on the podcast description. So on the second question, like it's a big ask, like so many famous people with electricity energy fields are already in a many podcasts. So I would say like in a somewhat niche way, if you can be someone who is, working on, who's more seeing energy related fields, perhaps like, okay, so perhaps like someone like I, especially like the Brookfield company, it's a big fund. So they have this big renewable energy related subsidiary that focuses on a lot of renewables, and they buy a lot of renewable plants. So perhaps if some like, senior manager who is overlooking investments from Brookfield Renewables, that'll be very interesting. And seeing his view on how he sees the market, how he sees the demand, and what kind of, like a newer energy system they want to invest. And just generally from the investment view, I think he or she can tell more, right, on what kind of investment mechanisms, structure they use, and just the return expectations and challenges they face across a different region, because it's a global company that work across the many fields. So that, like, finding someone from there will be interesting who can provide like a good insights into the field.
Amazing. That was Enkhtur Lkhagvajav, Director of Energy, Renewables, and Projects at MCS Group, joining us from Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. I'll put links in the show notes, including his LinkedIn. Enkhtur, thank you so much again for your time. This was one of the best conversations I've had on the podcast. And wishing you a continued success in your future endeavors and work at MCS and beyond.
Thanks, Terry. Likewise, I wish you the well, and I hope like in next few years we can talk more about more successful big renewable developments in Mongolia that perhaps like will be more interesting for viewers then, because I think we can do like a very global standard, large enough projects in Mongolia, and I think we're very close. And if those happen, then like at some point, like it'll be very interesting and very insightful if we can talk more on that. Yeah,
absolutely. Very much looking forward to that future success. And as we Mongolians say, "Yurut bakashke," right? Listeners, if you got something out of this, the most full thing you can do is to send it to one person who works in this space. I'm Terry Rumbold. This is the Polaris Energy Finance Podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode.